Good afternoon, good evening and good morning everybody who's joining us from around the world today. I'm Jane Falkingham. I'm a Professor of Demography and International Social Policy, and I have the very great pleasure of being the Director of the ESRC Centre for Population Change and the PI of the Connecting Generations Research Partnership. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Zack Grant today to give this Thought Leaders talk. Zack is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Nuffield Politics Research Centre at the University of Oxford, and his research is focusing on why people in the UK and other advanced democracies, not why, or how they perceive inequality, the welfare state, immigration and the environment, and the way that they do that. He's also interested in explaining why and how party systems change over time, and in particular how we can best understand the growth of relatively new political organisations such as the Greens and modern nationalist parties. And Zack uses a range of different research methodologies to do this, including quantitative survey data and experiments. He was the recipient of the British Academy Innovation Fellowship for his work on intergenerational political divides in 2022-23, and in this project he's researching attitudes to age divides and inequality within British politics and society. This work is carried out in collaboration with Connecting Generations partner, the Resolution Foundation, and is undertaken with Professor Jane Green and Professor Geoffrey Evans. And it's this exciting work that Zack will tell us a little bit more about today. We also have a distinguished panel here today to comment on the work. We have Diana Smith, who's Associate Professor of Geography and Environmental Science here at the University of Southampton, and her research interests include the mapping of social and health inequalities. And we also have Dr. Matt Ryan, who's Associate Professor of Governance and Public Policy, again here at the University of Southampton. And he's also co-director of the Centre for Democratic Futures, where he co-leads research to identify threats to democracy, and probably demography as well, and investigates strategies to protect it. This event is being recorded, so I appreciate if you could save all your questions to the question and answer at the end. And I'm just really excited to hand over to Zack. We have there's lots of writing about the generational divide and the emergence of age-based politics, particularly in the US. So I'm really intrigued and delighted to find out a little bit more. So the floor is yours, Zack.
Thank you for that lovely introduction.
And I'm going to move so I can see your slides.
If I stand here, am I all right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I was saying I feel like my experience of Southampton, the weather, has left me feeling a bit like Goldilocks. I was here in September presenting at the Elections and Public Opinion Conference down at the Oceanographic Centre, and it was about 35 degrees, and I was presenting in what felt like a greenhouse. And yesterday it was absolutely torrential rain on the way to my hotel, and I discovered that I have a hole in my shoe. So hopefully next time, if I come back here, I'll have a nice, mild 20-degree day. But despite the weather, I'm really pleased to be here, actually, and be invited by the Connecting Generations Partnership, because I feel like the work you're doing here, looking at how age groups support each other, whether that be through the transfer of money or time in terms of caring duties, really dovetails nicely with the work that I'm doing with Jane and Jeff at Nuffield College, which is basically about applying that question of whether and why generations support each other to politics. And the overarching question for this project is this: when it comes to politics, are generations selfish? Is all that the old care about pensions and social care? Are the young far more concerned with things like housing and childcare and don't really care so much about spending on elderly-oriented issues? There's been a lot of talk about this recently in the press and a lot of assumptions made, and we really want to sort of get some data and interrogate this question more closely. And sort of spoiler, the argument that I'm going to be presenting and kind of flows through all of the work that we've done on this topic, so that actually there's actually a good deal more of intergenerational consensus than conflicts. And actually when you look at preferences on key items in public spending that benefit people at different stages of the life cycle, you actually see that younger and older adults do want government to invest money in services aimed at each other. And one of the reasons a key reason I'm going to argue for this is that age is cross-cut with family connections, and people have concerns about their relatives in different stages of the life cycle to themselves, and therefore want government to do more to help people at different stages of the life cycle. So today I'm going to give you a bit of, I hope you can see this, a bit of a background of why we came to this topic, why we think it's an interesting one to study, age divides on public spending preferences. Then I'm going to introduce you to the data set, which we were funded by the British Academy to gather, which asked about 6,000 British adults their attitudes to various topics on intergenerational spending, as well as their family, etc., and their vote choice. and show you some descriptive statistics from that. Then I'm going to quickly give you the sort of match of the day 2 version, the highlights from 2 of the studies we're working on based on this data set. The first one, Family Matters, is going to looking at why certain older people are more generous in terms of their attitudes to government spending on the young, things like housing and childcare. The study 2 is going to be looking at the inverse of that, and looking at why certain younger people are really keen for more spending on pensions and social care. But the common theme, again, throughout all these papers is the role of family connections and how concerns for your relatives at different stages of the life cycle than you have the potential to ameliorate and constrain, I guess, age-related political polarisation in an ageing society. So just a bit of background, I'm sure probably most of you are aware of this, but age is now the big divider in British elections. What I've done here is I've taken, using British election data going back to 1964, as well as the most recent edition of the Internet Panel, the British Election Internet Panel in May 2013, but the last one is vote intention, the rest is actually vote cast at each election. I've taken the ratio of the Conservatives' lead over Labour among over 60s, and then divided that by the ratio of the Conservatives' lead over Labour amongst the under 40s. So basically you can interpret these dots as how many times better the Conservatives performed amongst the over 60s relative to those under 40. The black line is there from age, and you can see the older, because it's above 1, so 1 would be they're perfectly equal, the Conservatives do equally well or badly amongst both age groups. While that number has always been a lot above 1 for a long period, the Conservatives have always been a bit more, done a bit better amongst the old. It's really exploded in the last 20 years, and currently the Conservatives do about 6.5 times better amongst the over 60s than they do amongst the under 40s. So age has gone from something that was, important, but not the main concern in British politics, to something which is now perhaps the dominant cleavage in British electoral politics. And at the same time, you can compare that to the decline of class. So I've done the same here. I've looked at how well the Conservatives perform amongst managers and employers relative to routine employees, working class people, assemblymen, miners, that sort of thing. And that used to be a much more important cleavage in British electoral politics than age, right up until about the late 2000s. But since then, it's really become eclipsed by age as the main cleavage in British politics. And the fact that age is the main cleavage in how people vote is that's not because I've measured class in a funny way using occupation. If you look at income, the ratio of people in the top quintile of household incomes to the bottom quintile of household incomes, or education, the ratio of Conservative performance among graduates relative to non-graduates, you see the same thing. So age is really the big one, and actually you can compare these directly. Age is now about as important in British elections as class was in the 1980s, which we often think of as a very sort of militant time for class politics. So age is important in electoral choice. But there's an important argument about how we interpret this. And a very influential argument presented by Tim Vlandus at Oxford, amongst others, is that a lot of this is actually, essentially, I guess you could say, a class divide a different type of class divide. And this is actually about competing economic interests between the age groups. And each generation is really pivoting towards the party that seems willing to prioritise public spending on them and their concerns, and to the exclusion of spending on groups at different stages of the life cycle. And this has led to the argument, this sort of gerontocracy argument, that due to the ageing population and the fact that older people vote a lot more, are much more likely to vote in elections than younger people, this is why, because a larger cohort of older people and they don't care about younger people, this is perhaps why we've seen the slowdown in wealth, slowdown in terms of getting on the housing ladder for younger generations increasingly, as well as the higher costs for them in terms of education and childcare and things like that. So the argument is that the Conservatives simply don't have an incentive to cater for younger people because they can win elections by the older vote, and that older vote doesn't really care about things like housing and childcare. While this has been the subject of a lot of speculation, we argue that actually there's often not been, there haven't been enough concrete efforts to really sit down and have a look at people's preferences on these key issues like housing, childcare and education and so forth. And we felt it's important to interrogate this question of our generation selfish politically, because otherwise there is a danger of a self-fulfilling prophecy here. If the Conservative Party, for instance, think that their elderly voter base don't care too much about childcare and housing, then they've got no incentive to provide those goods. And conversely, if Labour come to power next election while winning very few votes of people in the 60s and 70s, they might feel, well, why should we be committed to the triple lock on pensions? Why should we be committed to a deal on social care? Because our younger base simply don't care about these things. But we're arguing actually, rather than this sort of generational self-interest battle, what we're suggesting is, in fact, that there could be a much greater degree of intergenerational altruism than has hitherto been considered. And age is not really like class as a social cleavage, partly because the borders of different age groups are much more porous than the divisions between class, for example. One obvious example of this is the fact that unlike class or race or ethnicity or religion, we each will hope to traverse each stage in the life cycle over time, which obviously gives the young an incentive to have a prospective interest in better quality pensions and social care because they know they're going to age, and also might make the old perhaps more empathetic to the struggles that young people face because they've been through that too. But the other way that age is cross-cut is by the role of family. Most of us will have connections to people at different stages of the life cycle with themselves. And we argue that this perhaps induces a concern for the well-being of those in different age groups. So there's a lot of political science interest recently which talks about how concern for in-group well-being, being told about how your actions in politics can affect those within your community, whether that be in your local neighbourhood, whether that be in terms of people of the same class background as you or the same ethnicity as you, can tend to ameliorate self-interest and lead you to be concerned more for the well-being of others. And on this theme, we think, although it hasn't been as explored as much, well, family really should be the sort of quintessential primordial in-group that people are concerned with. And we think one of the actually underappreciated consequences of high levels of intergenerational equality, this idea that the older groups are getting more wealthier relative to younger groups, is that many older people are going to be exposed to people within their family who will be struggling with things like the high costs of childcare, high costs of education, not being able to get on the housing ladder. And we argue that people should be willing to perhaps factor in the well-being of their younger and older relatives into their political preferences for two reasons. One is just simply emotional bonds. People care about the well-being of their family members. I probably don't need to show you too much citations on this topic that people do care, but we cite a lot of studies in the paper that have shown that actually people in their 50s and 60s who have older children that are doing financially poorly often tend to have worse sleep quality, often tend to have lower qualities of life themselves, often tend to express higher rates of depression than other people their own age. So there's this idea that because you care about the well-being of people at different age groups, you sort of have an altruistic reason to try and help make government provide for them. There's also this idea which we call the linked fates argument, which is actually kind of a more, I guess, a version of the enlightened self-interest argument, which is that you yourself might not feel insulated from the precarity facing your older and younger relatives. And we have two nice examples from the BBC News here recently. The first is that the Bank of Mum and Dad is now in one of the top 10 largest mortgage lenders in the country. I think the average parental contribution towards a mortgage or deposit is about £27,000 now. As of that article, it's probably gone up since then. That was 2019. And the other one is about this idea of, and that's about sort of older people passing down money to help their younger people with issues like the housing ladder. But we also see help going the other way as well, as I'm sure Jane could talk about a lot here. This idea that if your older relatives are struggling because they can't get good quality social care, they haven't got enough money to sort of renovate the house to make things easier as they age, that's going to have implications for you because you might have to step up and provide a lot more unpaid care to your elderly relatives than you might like to, because it might mean having to drop out of the workforce, or it might, and it just simply could be quite stressful in terms of time. So you've got a self-interested reason to want government to step in and help people in different generations. And the scale of the transfers, which I think some of Jane's work talks about in terms of time and money that people are giving to their older relatives, the younger relatives, really makes it credible that you might think it cheaper in a way to have government sort of insure you against the risk of having to provide for a relative in a different age group yourself by increasing state provision for that relative, be it in social care for the old or housing for the young. So in terms of the academic literature on this topic, actually the role of the family has been surprisingly understudied when you have a look at the research that's out there. There has been some research recently on the impact of child rearing in particular, and that's found that new parents, especially mothers, tend to be more pro-state childcare, healthcare and education. So when you've got a young baby, you seem to be, and there's panel data that suggests this too, you seem to become more pro-government intervention in these areas. There's other research that suggests that fathers of daughters tend to be more gender egalitarian in their attitudes, more feminist in a way, and also the mothers of boys tend to be less pro-military intervention. All these studies here can basically be premised on the fact that people care about their children and therefore want politics to increase the likelihood that they're going to be able to flourish and grow up safely and maximise their well-being throughout their life. But big gaps remain here. A lot of this stuff is based on the impact of, particularly the stuff on social spending, is based on the impact of having a young child. There's much less stuff on the impact of worrying about the well-being of people you're not actually legally responsible for, as you're not in this country. So your older, younger adult children or your elderly relatives, which is a bit different because money going to state childcare or healthcare or primary education when you're a parent is actually really subsidising you, the parent. It's not necessarily subsidising the child per se. So it's a little different to the question we're looking at. And certainly there's very little stuff that's actually looked at people who have better and worse off relatives. So it's not just about having relatives in different age groups, it's actually thinking they're struggling financially and looking at the effects of that. People haven't really studied the impact on policies like housing, social care and pensions, etc. And they haven't really distinguished between this argument about altruism and enlightened self-interest that I presented a second ago. Alexander Jabor kind of beat us to the punch last year by publishing an article which suggests that around the world, in Europe, parents that are cohabiting with their adult children are less likely to approve of the incumbent government, presumably because they haven't managed to help free up their spare rooms recently. But she only really looks at government approval. She doesn't really look at policy. And part of this is an limitation in existing social science data sets. Most data sets either lack political items, talking about your political preferences, not just your general, do you want more tax or less, but how do you feel about particular items of public spending, or they lack details of whether you have family members in different generations and how you feel about them, or they lack both more commonly. So this is why we gathered our own data set, which we call the Study of Intergenerational Political Preferences in Great Britain, or Intergenpol-GB, which is out now, and can be linked to the British election study. And we asked 6,000 adults in August 2022, generously funded by the British Academy, about their preferences on things like housing, childcare, education, so forth, social care, pensions, as well as their vote choice, their general attitudes about people in different generations, and their perceptions of how well off their family are doing. And we believe it's the largest available data set on this topic, certainly in Britain. So we think this is a good advance on the data sets for studying these types of intergenerational conflict or consensus issues. And yet it's now publicly available to download if you're interested, and it can be linked to the British election study, which obviously expands the number of topics you can study using this data set. So again, we have many measures of support for those at different stages of the life cycle. For example, here is just one of those. Would you support or oppose increasing government spending on the following, even if it leads to increases in taxation or a reduction in spending elsewhere? I might have shortened the wording there, but I promise it does make grammatical sense in the actual survey. So that latter line there is to make sure people remember it's not a free lunch, and actually spending on other groups has implications for the spending on other areas. And so here are some of the items we put about that. Increasing the amount of affordable housing built locally. I think it says in your local area was the exact phrase. Council housing built in your area. Free education for university students. Free vocational and technical education for non-university students. Free childcare for preschoolers. Increasing the state pension even if average wages and prices are not going up. That's basically the triple lock. We thought about asking about the triple lock, but we were worried most people would just be like, what? Particularly if you're under 60. So there's a description of that, as well as a differently worded item about interventions to help mobility and activity, this idea of healthy ageing programs for the elderly, and also free adult social care for the elderly. These weren't all just one question, we asked them at different points in the survey. And on a scale of 1 to 5, do you strongly oppose it or strongly support it? And I'm going to show you data excluding those who just said they didn't know. So I just want to have a little benchmark for what intergenerational conflict looks like. And this is from the most recent wave of the British election study, is quite a nice example. So here we've got from these are the average levels of support for each of the measures with a smooth polynomial line there, and as well as the 95% confidence intervals. And here, so for each age, you can see how supportive people are of a different measure. On the left, there are actually quite big divides over what's sometimes called these social cultural issues in British politics. So on rejoining the EU, we can see that very strongly splits the generations. Younger people will be very keen on that, older people not so much. And also on these more sort of social liberalism divides. So there was an item in the survey which asked, should the BBC show more same-sex parents on children's TV shows? Younger people were, particularly the very young, were quite in favour of that. The older people were very against it. And there was another one which tries to get at this item about like woke issues, I guess you might call them, which is about should we have fewer straight white males on university reading lists or school reading lists or something like that. And very young people were just about in favour of that, but it was very unpopular amongst older people. So on these social cultural issues, there's about an average 36 percentage point gap between the under 40s and the over 60s. However, you don't see such a big gap when you actually look at the items which are about spending on different age groups, particularly. So here I've got the items on spending on the young, items which typically benefit the young. So more spending on affordable housing, council housing, free university education, free vocational and technical education, and free childcare. And okay, childcare is a little bit unpopular amongst the older people, as well as free university education, but not drastically unpopular. It's still about 45% of people say they're in favour of it. What's interesting is the childcare goes down and then up again around 65, which I think might be a grandparent bump, I'm guessing, and then just goes down again. Council housing is actually more popular amongst older people than younger people, presumably because they know what that is, maybe. But the main ones we thought were really interesting is that affordable housing and vocational education actually have, and and council housing as well amongst the old, actually have quite a large degree of intergenerational consensus and support amongst older people, which is not what we'd think from when we read articles about NIMBYism and, and sort of the idea that older people are selfish, perhaps. Vice versa, you can see, looking at the items of spending on the old, you can see that actually younger people are very favourable about adult social care and this idea of interventions to support elderly people with mobility issues. Triple lock pensions, they're slightly opposed by the very youngest people, but once you get above 27 and 28, a clear majority of that group are also in favour. So there are age divides, particularly on these issues of older people, but when you look at the absolute levels of support, you do find that younger people are still quite positive about spending on the older people, and vice versa, older people are actually still quite keen on some of these provisions which don't really benefit their age group so much. And I put the average age divides there. The average age divide on the youth issues is about 10 percentage points between under 40s and over 60s, and it's about 20 percentage points on the items on older issues, which is still a lot smaller than these age gaps on cultural issues, which suggests that the vote may be more about these cultural issues than these self-interested spending arguments. And we also asked one about prioritisation, so we asked them about, okay, you've got to pick 3 of these things, which of these would you pick? And we had 4 items which were aimed at young people, 4 items which were aimed at older people in blue, and 2 items which are kind of not age-related as such. So it would be perfectly possible for people to ignore in their picks, to ignore the items which are not benefiting people of their age group, because you only get 3 picks, so you could pick all the 4 items benefiting older people, or 2 benefiting older people and 1 on the border force, for example. So you don't have to pick the items aimed at younger people in this, or the different age groups to you in this forced choice trade-off. So when we ask people, if you had to prioritise in this area, which would you prioritise? So moving away even further from this idea that you can get a free lunch, you have to sort of trade off against things that might benefit you. What do we find? Well, we actually find that a majority in every age group were prepared to spend at least one of their free picks on an item benefiting those in a different age group. So consistently, majorities were prepared to prioritise spending aimed at those at a different age group than themselves. So again, this seems like evidence for a lot more intergenerational altruism than intergenerational conflicts in British politics, and I can come back to that later if that's... so a surprising degree of intergenerational consensus on these issues, and we argue that family considerations are key in constraining age-related polarisation on these tax and spending topics. So we have 2 working papers looking at that in depth, which I'll just go into now. The first, Family Matters, is looking at adults over 40 with financially precarious younger relatives, which is the topic of our Resolution Foundation report, which is also out now. And the latter one, Care Risks, which is kind of the inverse and is looking at adults under 60 who are worried about having to support their struggling older relatives, perhaps with health and financial issues. So again, 2 papers, and I'm just going to take you through the highlights now. So the first one, again, is focused on those in middle-aged and older age groups, and I've bunched them together here. In the paper, we show that all our results can be replicated if you just look at the over 60s, but for statistical power reasons, I've put them together. Middle-aged and older voters, perhaps rather generously, 18 to 39 is our young adults portion, but I like that anyway, for selfish reasons. So we asked them, thinking about your own close family, how well off family members in the following age groups doing financially on average on a scale of 0 to 10, with 0 being doing very badly and 10 being doing very well, or they could say, actually, I don't have any close relatives in that age group, thank you very much. And you can look at, if you said 0 to 4, we count that as you have relatives doing badly, struggling financially. If you had 6 to 10, we said that you have relatives doing well financially, 5, neither, and then the other group is people who don't have any close adult relatives at all. And we also asked about the well-being of relatives in middle-aged and older age groups as well. So just descriptively, you can see here, this is the percentage of people that have young adult relatives in the red that are doing badly financially versus have middle-aged adults, relatives doing badly in blue, or have relatives over 60 doing badly. And overall, 1 in 4 people aged 40 plus have a financially struggling younger relative. That's about 17% of the electorate, or about 8 million voters we worked out. Now, we called this group of voters Family Fortunes voters on an interview with Matt Chorley, because I was hoping we'd put that out there and it would become like sort of Essex Man or Redwall Man or Waitrose Woman or one of these other sort of political nomenclatures, but it promptly sank like a stone and no one ever used that term again. So we failed to get Family Fortunes voters into the political lexicon, but we actually think this is slightly disappointing, not just for self-interested reasons, but we think it's actually quite interesting to look at this group. And I'd just say there also again to point out, you're more likely to have a young adult relative doing badly than at any other age, unless you're in your mid-70s. So it's when people think about their family, it tends to be the young adults that they think of as struggling financially the worst. So I'll just quickly here, basically all this shows is that you're more, I'll skip this, but all it shows is you're more likely to think your relatives are doing badly if your child is not on the property ladder and doesn't have a degree, and that's even when you control for the well-being of the parent themselves. So it's particularly people whose children are not on the property ladder and haven't been to university that are particularly worried about their younger relatives. And I'll have to skip for this for instance of time, but I can go back to that if you want. Let's look at the preferences of these people. So in the red, I've got the people with financially struggling relatives, how they feel about each of these items, their likelihood of supporting or strongly supporting it, versus the grey, everyone else. And you can see consistently, a majority of the people with struggling younger relatives support each of the items, and the gap is quite considerable in some cases between them and other people their own age, particularly there's a 16-point gap on increasing free university education, for example. So clearly this isn't the only reason why people in their 50s and 60s, etc., want to spend money on these young adult-oriented spending items, but it does seem to have an effect. Here I average support for all 5 of those items, and this is a regression which compares how supportive on the 5-point scale of the average of those 5 items people whose young adult relatives are doing badly are relative to those whose relatives are doing well, and those who do not have relatives. And the X is the bivariate difference, and the black circle there is once you control for a lot of things, so the parent or the respondent's own age, gender, education, income, savings, property, occupational class, ethnicity, region, their evaluations of their own finances, their evaluations of the national economy, and even their general attitudes to tax and spending. So do you in general think tax should go up or down, regardless of how you think about these items on youth spending? And you still see that those who have struggling younger relatives are still quite a bit, I think that works out at about 0.3 to 0.4 standard deviations more supportive of these items than people whose relatives are doing badly. They're also in red here more likely to have said we want to prioritise affordable housing and the trade-off task, and also more likely to prioritise one of the policies aimed at younger adults in general there. And they're also increasingly less likely to vote for the Conservatives. So amongst those who don't have financially struggling young relatives, this was in August 2022, just before the Liz Truss shock and the Conservatives polling sort of fell through the floor, but you can see that the Conservatives were in the lead amongst this group, whereas those who had struggling relatives, Labour were actually in the lead, and this also would hold if you just looked at the over 60s alone, so it seems to also affect their vote choice intentions as well. Here again a coefficient plot controlling for all of the stuff I talked about earlier on, and you can see that those who have struggling relatives are about 0.12, so these are linear probability models, so it's 12 percentage points more likely to have prioritised one of the items aimed at younger adults, and even controlling for this, about 0.8 percentage points less likely to support the Conservatives than those who have relatives who are doing well financially. Again, so it's not just the case that those who have struggling relatives are themselves poorer or themselves more left-wing in other ways. It does actually seem, it's still only observational data, but it does seem credible that we have an effect. I'll go very quickly through the care risks paper, because this is the one we're more working on. So, as you can see from the last graph, very few people have older relatives that are struggling financially, but that might not be the only reason you are worried about your older relatives. So we also asked, we also focus on this topic of care risks, and we say that your political preferences can be motivated by the experience or fear of having to provide substantial financial or practical assistance to a close family member who becomes unable to support themselves. And to measure this, we ask people, during the next 10 years or so, how likely or unlikely is it that you will need to give significant financial or practical assistance to a close family member in their 60s, 70s and over with their care or housing needs? So the idea is if you said this was more likely, you're slightly more worried about having to provide for an elderly relative, most likely a parent, within the next decade. So overall, we found that about just shy of 30% of all adults said this was likely in the next decade. And then here we show the breakdown, as you might expect, this is fairly heterogeneous by age. And it's the peak of terms of worrying about this is when you're in your late 30s and early 40s, when we found that about 40% of people were worried that in the next decade, the next 10 years, I'm going to have to give a significant amount of support to an elderly relative due with their needs. And this falls thereafter, presumably because you start to lose elderly relatives, sadly, once you enter your 50s and 60s, and there's not very many people in their 70s who are worried about this. But amongst people who are still basically young adults in their 30s and 40s, there is still a large amount of worry about having to look after an elderly relative. Sorry, Lawrence, I'm going to have to skip through this very quickly. But the effects are a bit smaller here. So here I think I've standardised these as well. So looking at people who said it's very likely they're going to have to support an older relative versus unlikely, they're about 0.2 standard deviations more likely to support the triple lock in pensions, about 0.4 standard deviations more likely to support subsidised social care for the elderly, and about 0.3 standard deviations more likely to support this elderly mobility, activity support, even when you control for this horrendous list of observational controls you can throw in there, which I can talk about at the end. So again, it's only observational data, but there still seems to be a pattern here. If you're worried about providing for your older relatives, you're more pro-elderly spending. Very briefly, I also threw in an experiment here where we asked, it is proposed that government does more to help older adults in their 60s, 70s and over access social care and remain physically active and mobile at the cost of a small increase in taxation that everyone, including yourself, currently pay. Blank, would you support or oppose such a policy? And in place of blank, they read they were randomly exposed to read one of these four justifications for why they should support this policy. The care risk thing made it clear that this will reduce the risk that younger adults have to shoulder the burden of looking after their parents and grandparents. They were also, we tried to give them a reason why that might help the economy, and then we also gave them the conventional reasons for why young people support the old, which is firstly that it's rewarding them for all the contributions they've given throughout their life, this idea that it's reciprocity for their past contributions to the country, and then also this future reciprocity argument, which is you're going to benefit from this yourself when you get old, essentially. So it's fair because you'll get the same thing one day. So they're the more conventional reasons why younger people might support spending on the old. And actually, what you find is the only one that makes a difference is the care risk frame. People are about 0.5 points more likely to support the point, or I think that's about, again, 0.2 or 2.1 standard deviations more likely to support the tax proposal. All the other frames made absolutely no difference. There was a 95% confidence intervals to whether people were more likely to support the proposal to raise tax for spending on the old. So I will just wrap up there. For the interest of time, I won't go through it, but we think family matters, and we think it's a reason what's constraining age polarisation in modern democracies. And if you want to know more, you can download our dataset there, you can download our report there, and our working paper there. And I could, if you really want, I can send you the care risk paper, although it's currently a gazillion words long, and I need to cut that down before we can submit it. But thank you so much for this opportunity. I hope you've enjoyed this talk.
Thanks, Zack. That was absolutely fascinating. I loved it. And I can't wait for the care risks as somebody who's just tipped over that line into the 60s. Really, really fascinating. So we've got about half an hour and we've got our two wonderful panellists who are going to give a quick response, and then I hope we're going to have time for the questions and answers. So I don't know, Zack, I was going to call you Zack Ryan. Matt Ryan is going to give the first response.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks Jane, and thanks Zack. So I think the first thing I want to say is to really praise Zack and Jane Green and Jeff Evans for this data, right? Because I think we undervalue how getting different kinds of data are really important. And as you've said, there is actually no data that covers this that I'm aware of, so it's a really good resource out there. There's a lot of work in political science that looks at trying to explain differences between age effects, cohort effects, basically playing with age categories to try and understand what's going on in politics. But this actually, it's the first I've seen where it actually asks about this connecting generations and in between different generations, so I think it's really good. Two things I'm really convinced by to start off with, which I think are really important. One is that this matters for politics. I think what you show is this is going to matter in some of the closer constituencies. This is probably something that's going to get people elected or not, because there's enough to show that support for political parties matters and is very clearly related to some of the concepts that you're looking at. And the second thing, I was really convinced by the experiment at the end, which I really liked, that the care risks is the framing that actually really changes people's response to support for policies for social care for older adults. So I think that was really interesting. The thing I thought was most interesting, which I'm going to ask you first about, is on slide 20, I'm getting a bit specific, but what was interesting to me is you asked this question about prioritization, and actually a majority of all respondents want to prioritize young people's policies. Okay, so there is a difference, but it's still a majority within the group that are not actually thinking about having younger people struggling. So that suggests to me that we have a problem in politics, because the politics is not responsive to young people's policies, irregardless of the relationship between the generations. So I wondered a little bit about, from a democratic theory point of view, one of the things you'd want is that you think immediately it's good if people are altruistic or even selfishly want to care for their for the younger generations. But actually, from a democratic point of view, you don't want people voting on behalf of other people, right? That's not a good relationship. I mean, that's actually how people used to argue that wives didn't need a vote because their husbands would take care of them and they knew how to vote for them. So really, isn't what we want that we actually want older generations to encourage younger generations to exercise their democratic rights and to vote? And is there anything that we could do to try and understand that relationship? Or did you think a little bit about, or after you've got these results, is it the fact that older generations feel like they should be taking care of the young, or should they be demonstrating some kind of, how to do democracy to younger people? So I was interested in that question around policies and that. The second thing would be to say a little bit about political socialization, your theory of political socialization within the family. Like, how is this actually being communicated, and how do you think about that? I mean, the reason I ask is that I'm wondering whether the between family differences are greater than the within family differences. So you're kind of suggesting that there's different types of families. Some of them are more concerned for young people and some of them are less concerned. But given that, again, a majority of people who are less concerned still want to prioritize one young person's policy when they have this list of 10 and they select. Now, maybe it was the items in the survey that caused this phenomenon, but I'm wondering a little bit about how you think this is being communicated within the family. Are people talking about it, or is it something else that's going on? And then I've one final one here. I'm not just texting, I just write this on the phone. So I wanted you to reflect a little bit on issues regarding, who gets to say what in a democracy. It goes back to my previous point. So one of the questions I had for you is, you focus on policies, and then you've connected those policy supports to kind of voting afterwards. But one of the questions, as I raised, is whether young people are participating enough in democracy. So one of the things I've struck me recently when I talk to especially Labour politicians is that they're starting to talk more about democracy issues and the structure of democracy. And I'm wondering, do you think those would become first-order issues rather than second-order issues, whereas what you've done is you've focused on the policies as first-order issues, in other words, social care, housing, which is a really interesting one, those kind of issues. But so what I'm hearing from some of the Labour politicians I talk to who think they're going to be in government very soon is that they think that these democracy issues about who gets to vote, how we actually structure democracy, will become the first order issues rather than about the policies that come through different voting. Because going back to what I said at the beginning, the work in the United States on period and cohort effects tends to say that what we're really seeing at the moment is a large cohort of potentially conservative-leaning older voters who tend to vote against the general liberalisation trends that are going on over time. So just a few reflections on that, but I thought it's fantastic work and really happy to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah.
We're going to hear from Diana, and then I'll give you an opportunity to respond, Zack. And meanwhile, if you're online, please do start posting your questions. Diana.
Thank you. And Zack, I'll hand you my notes in just a moment, so don't worry about taking too many. Okay. Also, you'll see I had to make mine larger because I'm in that middle age category. So unlike Matt, I couldn't read it off my phone, unfortunately.
I'm a young adult according to this.
I would also agree. I was really excited by this. I love data. I'm a geographer who loves data, and this is something I look forward to using in my teaching as well. So it's brilliant to see new data emerging and being made available. So thank you very much, and for a really well-designed and interesting survey. I thought your presentation was fantastic. It gave me a lot of things to think about. I think given the social and political tensions we've seen in the US, where I'm from, as you can tell, and here in the UK, it's really interesting to think about these things and consider what role family might have in the way people choose to vote and their political behaviors and allegiances more broadly, especially as we're seeing things becoming so much more tense and possibly divided within families. I thought that kind of exploration of cohesion within families, which is what you've done as I see it, was really interesting. I liked that there was consideration that was in the paper, which I did read a bit of how people defined family. You allowed people to self-define family, and I thought that was really interesting as well. So it wasn't having a very kind of straightforward version of what makes family. Is it parents and children, or how would that work? And I was really interested in terms of multi-generational families, and this comes into my thoughts around being a geographer. So how much does geography and proximity matter? Does it matter if you have granny living in the same house, or as, again, the area I grew up in, a very rural area, granny lived across the field frequently. So does having that proximity to an older person perhaps influence what people would choose to do and their perception of risk or their need to care for them later on in life? And equally, that kind of leads on to my next thought. So I was thinking around that and thinking about how even the school where my son goes now, I see grandparents picking up children quite frequently. So I think there's something interesting around proximity of the different generations and how close they are to each other. I do have to comment on age. As someone north of 40 who doesn't yet consider herself middle-aged, really, maybe in a bit of denial, I wonder if it would be worth looking at. And you did touch on this, so you can probably just say, well, Diana, we covered this. But whether 40 was an appropriate cutoff for older, because so many people are having children older and are probably dealing with childcare risks, childcare costs rather, at the age of 40, not so much in the 30s. So that was something I was curious about, is looking at the cutoff age. But again, I do get obsessive about data and surveys, so that's part of it. I also wondered about social mobility and whether there was any way to capture social mobility and whether that had any influence on the way people responded to what they were worried about in the kind of younger populations. As an aside, watching your presentation, I was really interested that people were considered not doing well if they didn't have their own house and a degree. And that's a very kind of maybe a class-based consideration as well. So I think I will probably wrap it up there, because I think that a lot of it was around the kind of proximity, the issue of social mobility, which you can say, well, we couldn't capture that, and that's fine. But I think that might be something to explore perhaps in literature and find out a little bit more about it, or also the role of close friendships. Because if I had a very close friendship with an older woman when I was living in her house in London, and I wonder how that might fit into, she would definitely not be family, but she was someone I cared about very much and therefore would have perhaps considered that. So kind of a lot of nuanced questions around the survey really, but overall, really interesting work, and I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you both for such a I'm glad this is being recorded so I can watch this later, because I'll almost certainly forget some of your excellent comments and not be able to address them now, but I will follow up on them later on. Just actually on the very, oh, thank you, that's very kind of you, thank you. Autograph too. Actually, that's your last point was really interesting actually about the social mobility point. So actually we could, I suppose we've got the data where we could look at this if there's an interaction where if you own your house but your child doesn't, does that make you more concerned? Because there's this idea that they're experiencing downward mobility then, right? And if you've been to university and your child hasn't, that's a sign of downward mobility. So you might expect those. I suppose, yeah, there is the large part of this, and we got criticism from some reviewer here, is that we asked people on a scale of 0 to 10, very well off to doing badly, but what that means to different people is going to be different, right? People are going to have different baselines for what doing well is, right? And I think actually one of a nice way of doing it, which I'm reading from your comments, is maybe we should try and look at more of interaction between how well off the parent is and their perception of how poorly off the child is, or their child's lack of assets. So thank you for that one. I'll just start on, if I can find my notes, the comments for Matt. The point about being bad for democracy is interesting, actually. I was reading an article by, I think it's Matt Berry, who was arguing that actually the real threat to democracy is the aging of the democracy. So the median voter, I think, for most of the post-war period was about 45. Now they're 51. And if you look at the median voter that actually votes, it's 55 now, up from about 46. And you're getting on to, I think we're now at the stage where the other stat I had is that in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, only 25% of the electorate was over 65. Now it's 33%, and it's likely to go up to about 38%. And Matt was arguing, I think his name's Matt, apologies if he's not, this breaks the unwritten rule of democracy that most of the people voting are equally exposed to decisions being made, because obviously in your 80s and 90s, as a lot of cohort there's an argument that you're perhaps not as exposed to the consequences of democratic decision making. And we were arguing actually that this is the way to save it, because those people in their 80s and 90s could vote on behalf of their child. So, but I think it's really interesting that you sort of problematize that and think, well, actually there's a dark risk about that, which I hadn't really thought of before. So I think that's quite an interesting point that as I'm not a political philosopher, I'm not particularly well versed to counter. But I think we'll try and acknowledge that more in our next version of the survey. It's clearly not so family, as you noted there, is clearly not the only reason why people support a lot of these policies, because they do have higher rates even amongst those who don't have struggling family members, which I think is really crucial to acknowledge. I mean, obviously, if you read Resolution Foundation reports, they say that the fact that young people can't get on the housing ladder, can't move to London where all the jobs are, is bad for the economy more broadly. So there are sort of enlightened reasons why older people might want the government to sort out the housing market, because that would help the economy more general. It would help people get into work. pay high rates of taxation, and therefore that has trickle-down effects on pensions and things like that. So there are obviously other reasons why they might have an interest in, other than also just ideas of just fairness as well, that I think it's important we acknowledge.
I'm going to save you
I'll
from
later on.
really tricky questions.
Thank you.
Because you'll be able to carry on afterwards, and just open up, we've got about 10 minutes left, and so we'll open up for some questions from the room.
Thanks very much. Really interesting talk. Really excited to see where these papers end up going. I suppose I just want to reflect on, I mean, the framing of this and why you think this is an urgent question is very much, countering a rhetoric or a narrative that's developing that, generations are selfish, that's but maybe, this is something that can, be found much more among kind of the chattering classes or people who are very politically invested than people, than the general public. So I suppose I have 2 points on this. One's a suggestion and one's a more general question. The suggestion is, could you look at people who are politically engaged, politically interested, and track the relationship and the generational divide within interested and less politically interested people? Because it could be that they're taking cues from a certain kind of political elite that is sort of promoting intergenerational divides. Also you could look at social media use and non-social media use. Certainly social media is a place where this narrative is very prevalent. And the second thing, which is more of a question, is, do you think there are any political parties that are actively putting themselves in the wrong place because, on any of these questions, policy questions, or more generally positioning and rhetoric, because they are influenced and they have bought into this concept of selfish generations? Do you think, in that sense, you think you're capable of, addressing politicians actively getting things wrong, or are politicians kind of in the right place because they have the right tools to study public opinion and they kind of know the stuff that you know, whereas, shouty people on Twitter don't know the stuff that you know, right? I suppose it's how important do you think this research can be? Are you changing sorry, this is a very long-winded question, but are you changing a sort of a social media narrative, or do you think you're capable of influencing political parties' decisions as well?
Thank you very much, Lawrence. Very good questions. Very quickly, the political interest thing, I haven't done that, but that would be very easy to do. We have, from the British Election Study, which we can link our data to, items on their social media use, their political interests. If you read the New Statesman on the left or the Telegraph on the right, you'd assume that young people hate the triple lock and older people really hate housing, because that's what you see in those elite articles. But actually what we find is there's more consensus on it. And I think, yes, that when you look at more ordinary people, there is a greater degree of it. So I suspect we would find that maybe there is a divide here between the politically interested engaged and the not so politically engaged. The point about political parties is interesting. So who do we think is... I think on housing, the Conservatives, I think sometimes, or many parties, see who turns up to shout at them about housing development at their sort of constituency services, and make inferences from a very small sample of people who can be very mad about sort of housing in the local area. When I think when you look at the polling, and it's not just our polling, look at YouGov's polling over time on this, there actually is a much more greater acknowledgement of the fact that housing is a big issue, in particular amongst older people in the society as well. So I do think perhaps there's one of the quirks of our constituency-based service system, where sort of smaller groups of people who are disproportionately influential can go and shout at MPs for large things. I think it might be that they're positioning incorrectly on housing. I think all parties are positioning incorrectly on social care. That's an issue that people haven't wanted to tackle for a long time, whereas I think our data suggests that actually younger people have a stake in it, one, perhaps because they care about their elderly people and they don't want to have to look after them, but also I guess there's this other argument which we don't touch on the paper, is that they're also worried about maybe their own inheritance being reduced if it all gets drained, with them having to pay, with their parents having to pay for social care, which is the sort of more negative Machiavellian reason. But thank you for both those points. I'll try and address them more in the next draft.
Thank you. Another question from the room? If not, I will go online. I have a question from Enoch, who says, do you know if there are similarities or differences in the intergenerational political divide between Africa and Europe?
Oh wow. Okay, that's a really interesting question. So first of all, I have no expertise in Africa at all. The one thing interesting is about Africa compared to Europe, though, obviously, is Africa has, I think, is it most sub-Saharan African countries have an average age of like 21 or 22, whereas in Europe it's like 49, and in East Asia it's 55, which is interesting because obviously the cohort of older people in those societies is so small that it's probably, and I imagine their spending on things like pension and social care is quite trivial anyway because they're poorer countries, that even if there are divides, it's probably just less politically relevant because if nearly all the voters are in their 20s and 30s, that's going to really skew it in one way. So it'd be interesting to pick up. I know there is a whole debate about in Africa at the moment how a lot of the leaders of several African countries have been around since the post-independence movement in Uganda and so forth. And there is a big divide between the younger generation who are perhaps more democratically minded and would want sort of to push on with reforms like that. So there is a elite people divide, which tends to be an age divide because of the demographics of the population. But I imagine the age divide in electoral politics will just be less relevant there because of the much younger demographics of the African continent. I think this is the reason why this is a pressing issue is because our demographics look very different now to how they did in the 60s and 70s. The older no longer a sort of poor and residual segment of the population. They're actually quite a large and influential segment of the electorate, which is why we've seen these issues come to the floor recently.
Yes, those figures you gave us on the median ages
Yes.
of the voters, that was quite...
Yes,
Yeah, absolutely. Athena says, thank you, Zack, for a brilliant talk, and thank you, Matt and Diana, for your insights. I was intrigued by the graph showing the class divisions are reducing, but age divisions are increasing. To what extent is what we are seeing an interaction between the two, i.e. people changing social class over age?
Well, actually, so that's actually a really interesting question. I think my colleagues at Oxford, Geoffrey and stuff, have done a lot of issues. That is actually about the changing dynamics of party competition. So one of the reasons people argue that class has declined is politics throughout the 90s and 2000s became much less oriented around left-right conflict over redistribution, which meant that class became less relevant. Your economic status became less relevant for your political preferences because high levels of tax and nationalisation were no longer on the ballot. And what's happened instead in the last 15 years is that we've seen the rise of these cultural issues like Brexit, immigration, perhaps more recently the stuff about trans and gender identity and things like that. And these issues, these cultural issues, polarise young and old much more than they polarise classes, because in the classes you often have a lot of socially conservative working class people and more socially conservative middle class people. So I think the issue here is that the issues that politics is being contested on have become increasingly cultural and less about left-right distribution, which means that they're going to polarise age groups much more than classes are. And I think that kind of does explain why you see you do see the negative correlation when the class declines, the age divide moves up afterwards. So I think yes, they are related, but they're due to the political supply side.
Great, and we've got another question which I think actually links across to something that Lawrence was getting up. It says, do you think that the media fuels age and generational divides, which then in turn influence political preferences?
That's a very good point. Yeah, I mean, it does kind of go back to what Lawrence was saying about this is at the elite level debates about this topic. I think this certainly is in terms, I presume you mean like national media rather than social media. Mm-hmm. I think, so I'm going to go back to what Bobby Duffy said about this. And a lot of this, the reasons why we see more polarisation, particularly around these social cultural issues, is that older people can now see more easily what younger people are doing because of social media and things like this. They're more exposed to the fact that younger people often have different values to themselves. And I think that, and it's quite easy to point out due to the social media, the one, whether it be the one sort of crazy group of young people that seem very radical or the sort of very mean-spirited group of older people that seem very one way or the other, and say like this is representative of the general trend, which is why I think it's good to have sort of public opinion, more high-quality public opinion social science data, which can suggest that actually these groups which get picked up on the media and editorials are not actually representative of age groups as a whole, as I think Bobby Duffy says in his book as well.
Brilliant. Well, I think we're running out of time. Just check around the room for any other final questions or comments. I think we're all going to have to watch the recording back, Zack. It was just such a fantastic tour de force and took us through things in an amazing way. So I just want to thank Zack, Diana and Matt for joining us today, for sharing their experiences. Thank you to the audience in the room and the audience online. It's great to have so many of you with us. On the screen right now, I think you should be seeing details of upcoming events, hopefully. So do add these to your diaries and sign up when the registrations are open. And in a moment also, for those of you online, you'll see a short poll on your screen, which we'll ask you to complete, and we'll immediately pass it on to Zack, because it's polling data. It'll take no more than 2 minutes of your time. Do tell us your thoughts. And we'll be sharing the footage of today over the coming days, so keep an eye on your inbox on how to access this. So thank you for joining us. Wherever you are in the world, in Southampton, hope it stops raining soon, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you. Gosh, and great comments.
Yeah, thank you both.